Hello, Daphne here with more insights for you about my mother's memoir titled Internment in Shanghai. This particular segment is called Death of Children, Eating Eggshells. Japanese internment camps in Shanghai were notorious for the internees being hungry, and that included the small children. This picture shown here is not of our camp, but of another camp in Shanghai during the early 1940s, where many Americans and foreigners that were loyal to the Allied forces were thrown into concentration camp by the Japanese Imperial Army. There was constant worry about the food and the lack of nutrients required by those who were young and growing. Tragically, some children died as a result of malnutrition. The only thought sustaining many of those locked up was that they eventually believed that they would be freed by the Allied forces. One of the horrors of being in Japanese concentration camp, among many, was watching the children starve. Doctors had little medicine to treat anybody for any kind of ailment. The doctors even asked prisoners to save save shells from their eggs. The shells could then be crushed, baked, and fed to the calcium-deficient children to aid in keeping their bones strong. Gosh, it's amazing how ingenuity comes forward. I guess it becomes a mother of necessity and invention in such circumstances like this. There were deaths nonetheless. As my mother writes, on July 6th came a tragedy, the more awful since it might have been avoided. Christopher Fox, beloved 6-month-old son of Sam Fox, and his wife sickened and died within just 2 days. We simply could not believe it. Only days previously we had seen him so adorable in his immaculate pram. The Foxes had also lost their first baby, so this was all the more precious to them, their little son Christopher. It started with a tummy upset, which grew and grew steadily worse. The doctors and nurses worked desperately as they watched him slip away. Can you imagine that? I can't. Permission was requested to send him out to the hospital, but as the child was so gravely ill and because the mother was not allowed to go, it took hours to force it through the Japanese militia. Finally, at about 9 that night, permission was granted. Dr. Walter Pott went with them and was still there in the hospital at 3 in the morning when the little boy died. The news hung over Chapai concentration camp where we were. It was a pall of like a big, huge black cloud. We all knew why the child had died. Even with the better food that had been brought in, it was not good enough for such small babies. Every mother in camp looked at her children and wondered how long they would be spared from the ravages of malnutrition. And of course, with malnutrition comes weakened bodies and more susceptibility to disease. So it was just an absolutely horrible situation. And my mother goes on to write, I held my twins close, feeling their warmth and softness, cursing myself for my refusal to go home to safety when Tom had tried to insist that I leave Shanghai all those many months ago. I want to insert here that when it became obvious that there were a lot of foreigners that were going to be thrown into Japanese concentration camps, my father pleaded with my mother to leave Shanghai. She absolutely refused. She wanted to stay with her beloved husband. So at this particular point in her own internment, she was having second thoughts on that subject. She goes on to say that very afternoon, both the twins had upset stomachs. The first they had in camp, and panic took over me. Would they go to death like Christopher? I wondered, but one of the doctors told me quickly not to worry, but I broke down in tears nonetheless. Nothing will happen to them, Dorothy, he told me. Stop imagining things. Look at them bouncing over there on Richie's bed. Do they look sick? In no time, he had me laughing at my silly fears. But the baby's death really did frighten the Japanese. Ben, who was the head spokesman for the internees, had the interaction with our captors. In righteous wrath, he told the commandant that something had to be done and quickly, and that he would hold them personally responsible for the death of any other child. Tsunami promised immediate redress. Soon afterwards, he called Ben to tell him that all children of 3 and under will be allowed to leave camp with their mothers. Each of us with children of that age were asked to furnish the name of some neutral with whom they could stay. Hope flamed, and innocently we gave addresses, but it never came to anything. I thanked our head Japanese guard. I knew he was sincere enough, but I am sure the Japanese consulate never intended that we should leave camp. Searches were conducted in internee rooms to find articles forbidden by the Japanese captors, but this is where the children came in handy. During these impromptu inspections, all adults had to remain indoors, but the children were allowed to go outside. So any illegal items the children would take, and they'd drop them in the bushes outside of camp to be retrieved by them later on after the inspection was over with. Oh, I love that. And for the little children, they had no idea about certain things. A mother, and this shows you how your mind really shuts down when you are in these bleak and horrible, destructive, decrepit surroundings. Anyway, a mother tried to explain to her daughter one day about what a river looked like, something really simple like that. And after going through this elaborate description, the little girl looked up at her mother and said, "Do you mean a gutter?" That was her only reference point to water flowing through something. There were older children taking care of younger siblings because their parents simply could not cope with imprisonment. They took over duties of cooking, cleaning, and laundry. They worked hard, and they spared their debilitated parents of unnecessary chores. My twin sister and I have no recollection of concentration camp. We were too young. Now my mother's memoir, Internment in Shanghai, is published for all to see, and I learned so much about our life that I didn't know that before reading this, that I hope that will be of interest to all of you. But it was a terrible time in history, and the horror perpetrated on human beings in Japanese concentration camps and the effect it had on children was nothing short of horrendous, and I'm not sure that that word is strong enough to describe the effects of having all your rights taken away, being stripped down to practically nothing, and the horrible effect that it had on children. Internment in Shanghai is a memoir, a testament to the human spirit. I hope that you'll decide to take a trip back in time into this historic document, a true story of a parent's fight for survival in war-torn China during the Second World War. Can you imagine if this would have happened to you? It's hard to believe. I mean, even though I was in the camp, I still can't imagine what it would have been like. But so, please give yourself a gift of this book. I think you'll learn a lot about a very unfortunate time in history.